Hi, good morning, everyone. It's a privilege and also a pleasure to be here. But I have to apologize first because I just fly in yesterday in the morning, 5:30 in the morning. So the jet lag is still with me. So if I am speaking out of tune, please bear with me. I think it's probably fair to say, from an adoption perspective of APM, there are multiple ways, and there are many, many different ways that you can do it. What we have done in the past 3 years is probably a way that we find fit to our organization and is something that we are proud of. So today, I'm going to show you in the next 20 minutes our journey. First of all, by highlighting our architecture and also a bit of appreciation on the size of organization as well, because that carries a lot of complexities. And also, I'm going to dive into some of the more detailed lesson learned that we have in the past 3 years' time, and some of the recommendations that we can share. So a bit of myself. Thank you for Yale. I've been with the organization for 12 years now. So the picture of me there has been taken a few years ago. So I've grown a few gray hairs, not because of APM. APM is always close to my heart. Monitoring itself is close to my heart. In the past 12 years with the bank, I've been predominantly actually working closely on monitoring, from infrastructure monitoring to application monitoring to APM, et cetera, et cetera. And now I have actually very recently transitioned to a role running site reliability engineering for our digital platforms, based out of Hong Kong, based out of Asia Pacific. And in my previous life, I was a developer as well as the software architect. So I've done both. I've done both sides, the dev side and also the ops side. So, and one of the reasons why APM is important from my perspective is because it actually carries a lot of protocol and also language between the two sides. I'm going to go into some of that details later on. So a bit about the bank. We're large. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But what I want you to focus on is not on how many offices we have, how many people we have in general, but the number of developers we actually have, or IT professionals we have. We have over or close to 40,000 IT professionals in the bank. If you think about monitoring, what that actually means is when you start changing a 40,000 IT-strong organization on how we actually monitor our application, how we look into our applications, or how we change our monitoring strategy, you're actually changing a lot of dynamics. You're trying to actually change a lot of culture as well. So I want you to remember that number, 40,000, from this slide. Okay. And the next slide, I'm going to cover a little bit on our high-level architecture. It's probably an overly simplified architecture diagram that I can share with the crew. I think it's probably fair to say for anything on the mainframe all the way to any modern PaaS platforms, we have it in the bank. Okay? And what that means is we have a lot of moving parts, and we have a lot of complexities in terms of technologies that we have to deal with. And also, everything from message queues, application servers, relational and NoSQL databases, language runtime like Java, .NET, Node.js, Go, Python, all the way onto mobile developments using Kotlin or anything that you're familiar with. We have all of that. Okay. So that carries a lot of complexities. And this morning, you've heard my colleague, Cheryl, shared the mandate on why 3 years ago, we started our journey in changing how we actually start delivering our services digital, and how much we're changing our delivery velocity, et cetera. But the very important thing that I want you to look at is the very right. While we are delivering all this, it's actually very, very, very important for us to actually stay on top of our application performance. So there's no point on delivering a service while it's not performing. Okay? So to us, performance or availability or reliability is the biggest feature of all of any single service that we deliver. So dating back 3 years ago, when we first started our journey, I remember the days when we were, at that point, we were very heavily infrastructure focused. What that actually means is we actually look at a lot of boxes, a lot of components, a lot of servers, and we try to actually understand how performance are like with those boxes. I think it's very common for a lot of organizations 3 years ago. We were, at the time, moving from a very virtual machines, server-based architecture to a PaaS platform as well. And we very quickly realized that with the migration to PaaS, we have to do things very differently. So we shouldn't be actually looking at what we have done 3 years ago. We have to look at the problem entirely differently. So we realized that something has to change there. And there are a lot of moving parts. What I mean by moving parts is when you have a lot of different tools that you are collecting a lot of data points or metrics, imagine how do you bring them together? Do we do it through an event management fabric, event management systems? You do correlations, manual correlations, or you do it through a more automated way? I think many different organizations have done it differently, have tried to do it differently. For us, because of the complexities, we were doing a lot of these correlations pretty manually. Okay. What I mean by manual is you look at you have people looking at a lot of this data and try to make sense out of it. When there's an incident, when there's a sunny day, whether we're doing well, whether we're doing not. And we were very much dependent on a lot of static thresholds. So we set up a lot of static thresholds to look after our performance. So let me give you an example. I think this example probably resonates. Every Thursday, 2 a.m. in the morning, a particular box always fires an alarm. CPU goes up to 90%. It pages out to a support staff. That poor person goes into the box, try to check what's happening. It's the backup job. Yeah, it happens all the time. The next week, it happens again. It happens again. It wasn't very healthy. No. So we, in HSBC, we were very, very keen to actually build what we call the healthiest human system. It's a very recent term in 2019, but back in 3 years ago, we were actually having systems that weren't actually helping us to build a very healthy system from the outset. The last one is my favorite. It's not that we don't have any common metrics between dev and ops, but we have to have that common understanding between the dev and the ops, and what metrics do we actually want the dev to actually tell to the ops, and what we want the ops to actually come back to dev. We weren't very good at it. And adding to that complexity, you have heard from Cheryl this morning that we actually were on a journey to actually migrate our large monolith applications to microservices and APIs. And here's a high-level topology diagram that I can show to you, that from the left, you see a very simple monolith applications. I call it simple. It actually wasn't that simple. There's a lot of moving parts, but it was simpler than what it is now when we are on the microservices. And I'll be honest, the right diagram is not exactly how it looks like today. There's a lot more complexity to it. I'm just, calling out the ones that I can paint the picture in front of you. Okay, so 3 years ago, we have all these challenges. What do we ask ourselves in terms of adopting APM? And what is APM? We ask, what does it bring to the table? And how does it solve the complexity challenge? And does it really bring dev and ops together? Because we're very quickly moving into that model. So to us, there's a lot of questions that we ask ourselves, that we ask to our developers, our operations staff. But the very, very key thing that we've found is it's all about application context or service context. So it's very clear to us our monitoring 3 years ago does not necessarily carry the service context or application context. So you have metrics that says a CPU of a box is 90%, but how does that relate to performance? How does that relate to your customer? It's very, very difficult at that time to actually correlate the numbers. There are a lot of things that we actually consider and we look into, but if I have to call out one specific element among all that, is the transaction tracing and visualization. That's by far the cornerstone that we realized in our past 3 years that has to be absolutely done right. Otherwise, you're not getting the value. Yeah? And getting that right gives you an exponential return of your value. Okay? And also, what that means to us is, because we're a bank, because we have a lot of different applications, not all of our applications are actually perfect for APM. Majority of them are, but some of the applications were not. Just simply not. Here's a better picture that I can show to you on our topologies. On the left, you have seen that. It's just a simple monolith application. On the right, on the top, is one of our internet-facing services. On the bottom is actually our API platform that actually is cross-sharing and also invoking each other. So the big bubbles, if you're familiar with APM product, AppDynamics, the bigger bubbles is actually an application on its own. Okay, so you're seeing actually a lot of different applications are interconnected to actually make up one service. Okay, it's not only the smaller bubbles that matters. So let me share with you our journey from 3 years ago. How did we actually start it? So we started with one application first. And the reason why we started with one application first is because we wanted to understand what APM actually is and how does it actually matter. At that time, we picked one of our internet-based applications, and we started to instrument it, we started to put technologies on it, we started to get all the data from the applications. And we had some very early successes. We've seen immediate topology of the application that we have never seen before. We start discovering things that we didn't know. It was in the head of somebody that was supporting the application for a long time. And it's great to have that opportunity to actually start sharing those information to wide audiences. But it's probably also fair to say, in order for us to actually roll out an APM solutions in 3 years' time, or at that time, 3 years ago, we tried to roll it out to majority of our applications. We found that it's not enough just to follow the processes that we had with the first application. And now, 3 years down the line, we are monitoring 600 production applications with APM. And we're using mobile and browser monitoring and user experience monitoring solutions. We are monitoring the APIs and microservices. Services actually runs on past platforms, and we're also monitoring a lot of our databases as well. So what are our lesson learned? And this is my favorite slide of the deck. Establish a center of excellence from the very beginning. From the very beginning. I'm going to go into, just because I love the term center of excellence, I'm going to go into a bit of more details in the next slides, okay, to share with you what I actually mean by a center of excellence, spelling out the details on what that is. But that's important. Keep that in mind. That's important. The second thing that we found very, very important, as well as the third one, is invest the resources and time to call out the transactions, okay? If you have instrument your applications, but you have not identified the transactions, you're not getting the value from APM, bottom line. And we find a lot of cases, some of our applications that we have done have not actually called out all the necessary business transactions, and we're not getting all the values. The third line there is invest resources and time to understand the data, because you're going to get a lot of data from APM. And the data itself could sometimes be interpreted in many different ways. You have to actually invest the resources and time of your best application and infrastructure experts to actually look at the data and interpret them and share that with the wider teams. Because with that understanding, you start to actually join the peoples up and also start changing the culture. So a lot of these are not about technology. A lot of these are about the people and how you actually mobilize your people to actually start sharing. The fourth one is one of my favorite as well. Establish what a sunny day looks like. So if you don't know what a sunny day looks like, if you don't know your data, if you don't know your metrics, chances are when the rainy day comes, you just don't know. Or it takes a long time for you to figure out, or for us to figure out what's actually happening. And we call it a triage journey. But what that actually means is when something goes wrong, there are better experts or specialists who has been supporting application, who understand the application inside out, who could actually help to say, if this metric goes up, if this metric goes down, if this goes wrong, here's what the problem is. You got to actually do your gameplay, have the experts call out all these journeys ahead of time, and share that with everybody who's involved in your pod or your cross-functional team. That would be a massive, massive winner. And last but not least, move away from infrastructure-based monitoring. 3 years ago, I remember when we were instrumenting some of our new applications, we have support teams actually come in with the questions like, how do I see my CPU? How do I check my network? How do I check my interfaces? How do I check my I/O, right? It has to be the case. I think we have to encourage 40,000 people, in our case, in our organization, to start asking questions like, what is my performance from a customer perspective? What is my performance from my application perspective? Not directly asking questions on the individual components, because chances are, because of the way that before APM or prior to APM, a lot of the monitorings that we have, or data points that we have, actually encourages people, or we trained our people to actually think, let's look at the components, okay? But APM is not about components. Right. I promised that I will share on the adoption process on setting up a center of excellence. And this is very, very, very important from our perspective, because we see the opportunity of leveraging APM as an agent of change and a way of changing our culture of how our people, our IT professionals, actually look at the problem, monitoring problem, or now the industry calls it observability. How do you actually observe performance of application? So we created our Center of Excellence with the following purposes. The first one is we do application onboarding. So every single application that gets on our APM product has to go through an onboarding process. And that entry point actually gives us a very powerful way of installing the practices, the education, the trainings, everything, and also the conversation and the engagement with your wider teams to build out what I would call an ecosystem, okay? The second point is also very, very important. You would want to embed internal consultancies. You want to embed your expertise within your organization, where they become the go-to person on questions, problems. Let me give you an example. So we have teams who build applications based on asynchronous technologies, and heavily asynchronous technologies. And we have team who builds solutions based on heavily synchronous technologies. We want the Center of Excellence teams to actually to know how asynchronous technologies actually works from an APM perspective, so that we can actually share those knowledges across different teams. We wouldn't want that to be resident in pockets of the organization, and where when there's a new application that comes in that uses asynchronous calls, we ask them to actually talk to another team. So we want to actually collect all this expertise within a central function to actually help us to scale. And that's a massive, from an internal perspective, that's a massive scaler. The third thing that we looked at is embedding what we call monitoring champions. It's actually a fancy name. It's actually a role that we see. It's actually not a named person. It's actually a role that we want to embed in every single cross-functional teams or pods. Because application changes all the time. This morning, Cheryl shared that we are pushing our new technologies and new functions at an unforeseeable pace. What that means is we're pushing our new APIs, we're pushing our new functions every single day. With the changes of the applications, you would want the teams who are actually pushing out these new technologies or new functions to stay on top of their own monitoring. And for doing that, in an organization of 40,000 IT professionals, we got to actually embed more people into those cross-functional teams, and also making them self-sufficient, but also not leaving them alone. We're building an ecosystem that we can join them together. And that's a key role of the Center of Excellence. And also, there's a lot of moving parts, infrastructures, agents, life cycles, policies, practices, security that we need to look after, and that's part of the role of the Center of Excellence. And in HSBC, we build a lot of applications, build once and deploy many times. We're operating in 61 markets, so it doesn't make sense for us to actually to look at monitoring 61 times when we build one application. So we do a lot of blueprinting of monitoring in the Center of Excellence, helping cross-functional teams to actually build it once and deploy it 61 times. Last but not least, there are a lot of innovations, technologies that's coming into APM. For example, machine learning, artificial intelligence. We wouldn't want to have these evaluations done by each individual pockets of cross-functional teams. We want that to be evaluated by the Center of Excellence so that we know what good looks like before we roll it out to the wider organization. And those are the key roles that we've seen in COE. In terms of the future, what do we mean by the future? The future, in the context of monitoring, is really about moving from a lot of the manual intervention, manual correlation of data into machine learning and artificial intelligence. And given that APM collects, from our perspective, from our experience, collects millions of metrics every minute. And with the data, it actually fuels a lot of energies into the algorithms that allows us to get a lot of intelligence out of the data. So machine learning-based analytics is going to be key for us. Having end-to-end visibilities all the way to the mainframe is important because as a bank, we have a lot of important systems that runs out of the mainframe. Monitoring as code, this is a very interesting topic that we have a lot of internal discussions and also debates and also designed work around this very topic. It's all about shifting monitoring towards the left. What that means is we want the developers to actually think about monitoring right at the outset of designing the applications, not as an afterthought. In order to do that, we have to create an ecosystem and also a framework that allows the developer to have that ease of expressing what monitoring looks like into their code. And that carries across from environment to environment all the way into production. And that's what monitoring as code is about. Serverless applications, the very interesting thing about monitoring is, but almost by definition, monitoring, you can't have a solution that actually monitors your new technologies before the technologies actually becomes available. So from our point of view, as a center of excellence, we always work very closely with architecture communities to actually look at what's coming next. And so that from a monitoring side, we know what's coming, what's going to be important, and how do we stay on top, and how do we get on the front foot. Serverless monitoring is one of them. And we're expecting there will be a lot more containers, and a lot more, in the magnitudes of hundreds of thousands, potentially, when our next phase of digital platforms actually gets fully rolled out. We're expecting hundreds of thousands of containers that's going to be in production. And how do we deal with that complexity? And how do we actually deal with containers that only live like 8 hours in a day? It's not going to be always there. It's not going to be like a VM. How do we deal with that complexity? These are all the topics that we are very, very interested in from HSBC. And I'll be keen to actually hear from the audience if there are any experience or there are any opinions on any of these topics. You know, I'll be here throughout the day, so feel free to grab me for a chat, and I'll be keen to share my view, and I'll be happy to hear your view as well. Right. So I know that I am in between lunch and yourself, so I'm only going to make 3 very quick recommendations. The first one is people and APM. So I've mentioned about the ecosystem, I've mentioned about COE, I've mentioned about investing in the resources on calling out all the business transactions, etc. It's not just the people, it's not just the APM, it's actually both. If you get both right, you're going to get exponential returns on how it actually works. Automate everything. I know this term is probably being used in too many occasions now by many, many different people who are speaking, but it's actually very true. So from laying down the agents to creating your dashboards, to creating your health rules, to creating anything, try to automate everything, because that helps you to scale. The last but not least is always focus on your business transactions or transaction tracing, because that gives you the full context. If it is a transaction-based application, make sure that you have all your important transactions confirmed and classified and called out and understood by your best experts who understand the application. It could be the architect, or it could be the support teams. Find your best people to help you to actually find their transactions. It's going to be massively, massively useful. Okay? Thank you.
Thanks, Fred.
Thank you. Yeah.
I hope you found the session useful. Thanks, Fred, for giving the audience a view as to what it's like to adopt an APM in an organization of your size. I've got a couple of questions, if that's all right.
Sure.
So I guess the first one is, you started as the global APM lead in HSBC, and now you've sort of transitioned to a different role in site reliability engineering. I'd love to understand what that means for you and what that means for HSBC.
Yeah. So from a personal perspective, I think as a developer, ex-developer, and also an operation person, I think moving on to SRE is almost like a natural thing. I think SRE was an attempt by Google to actually look at solving a lot of the operational challenges. And from our perspective, from a digital perspective, reliability of a service is most important. So, and APM is actually helping us to collect a lot of this data. And how do we, I think from our perspective, is how do we actually analyze all this information with the help of machine learning, artificial intelligence that coming down the line to help us really ensure reliability is actually up there, yeah, as we go through the complexity challenge. So we are investing a lot of investigations on what does that mean from digital HSBC to actually adopt SRE. Yeah, I think it's probably also a fair assessment at this point. Will not be actually borrowing the entirety of SRE into our organization at the outset, right? Because we are probably quite different, as we have a very different culture as well. But SRE itself is actually potentially a very big cultural changer to us. So it's very close to my heart, and it's a very, I think, a positive way of changing how we actually do operations going forward as well.
I guess one last question before we drop out for lunch. You talked, Cheryl mentioned that back in 2016 you did 10 major releases per year, and now you've done over 300 to date in 2019.
That's correct.
I just wanted to understand how you sort of organize yourselves as you transitioning to a much faster pace and what that meant for the teams.
Yeah, so we are organizing ourselves into smaller organizations. We call it cross-functional teams. I think we borrowed the term from Amazon. And what that means to us is we are operating in much smaller teams and also in a much more agile way. And with that, we bring in different experts or different expertise into smaller pods that we start to execute much quicker. But what that means from monitoring, more importantly, from my perspective, what that means from monitoring point of view is you've got to embed your monitoring champion in each and single one of those pods, those cross-functional teams. There might actually be some early resistance somehow because there's not a universal understanding of what monitoring actually means. Some people actually interpret monitoring as, oh, it's VM, is CPU, is memory. It's important to have a center of excellence to actually explain what we're trying to do. And once people actually understand what monitoring or observability, as a better name nowadays, means, people get on board, and you're going to get exponential returns from having those conversations and also embedding the right practices into the cross-functional teams.
Great, that's really helpful. Thanks, Fred. And
Thanks.
again, thanks for traveling from Hong Kong.
No worries, mate.
No.
Thank you.